Cool.
All right, shall we start?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, cool. So, hey, everybody, this is Dan,
And this is Ron.
and this is a very special episode of a nominee we're calling Pod and Four Persons. Uh, and we have two very special guests on today. One of them you're familiar with, John Sanborn. He's been on the program a few times. He's a good guy to have in your corner, so we keep inviting him on. And we also have representing the Cryptic Corporation, Homer Flynn, and his library. And so we're going to talk about a very special thing that happened a few months ago. The Cryptic Corporation are they manage the band The Residents, and the Residents just put on the first ever live performance of their seminal album God in Three Persons at the MoMA, and I believe there was a rehearsal gig or performance in San Francisco before it moved over to the MoMA.
Yeah, there was. We have a good relationship with the lab in San Francisco, and they were extremely gracious in terms of giving us the facility for a couple of weeks to be able to do a paid rehearsal. And once again, the fact that they allowed us to come in there took a much more developed show into the moment than we would have had otherwise.
Mm. And so, how did the live performance come about? Because I was reading a little bit to get ready for this interview. It sounds like it was in the works for quite a while.
It was in the works for quite a while. You know, the Residents have a very positive, long-standing relationship with the MoMA, which started out with Barbara London, who was a curator there. She may have been the first curator, certainly one of the first in the film and video department. And she kind of latched on to the Residents back in the 80s. And she did a pretty well-known, well-accepted series called Looking at Music. And the Looking at Music series started out as music videos. Then there was another music video one, and then there was one that was a lot about CD-ROM. And the Residents were pretty heavily featured in these. And when Barbara retired about 3 or 4 years ago, usually when you have a relationship with somebody at one of these museums, your value is as good as that relationship. And when that person goes, well, okay, it's like that's the end of that. But she connected me with Ron Magliozzi, and Ron and I have connected. And then there's another younger woman, Sophie Kavalakos, and we've connected with her too. So we've been talking with them for quite a while about doing something. And what happened was that the primary venue that they had was something that they call Modern Mondays. And Modern Mondays really was a kind of a lecture series where directors would come in and they would show something and then do a Q&A afterwards. And ultimately, they were kind of trying to shoehorn us into something that for the most part was not a great fit. And it kept going back and forth and back and forth. And ultimately, I think it was when, John decided to get involved in this. He and I had a conversation. And I think to a great extent, the idea of bringing John in and making this a collaboration between the Residents and John was kind of the thing that pushed them over the edge in terms of we've got to make this happen.
Yeah.
And when that was like about trying to think, over a year ago, a couple of years ago probably. And everything started picking up steam at that point. And, the deadlines were tight. There was conversation at one point, well, is this going to be too tight because we had to raise additional money? The MoMA did not have or would not put up enough money to make the whole thing happen. So things just kept stumbling forward in their own way. And ultimately we said that, nope, we're going to make this happen, and we're going to make it happen on this schedule. And I can't say how grateful I am, thankful that we are that we made that happen, because, the door slammed shut within a very short few weeks after the performances. And
I would say a lot of this is the testament to being around forever. So the residents obviously have a decades and decades long history. I was also very good friends with Barbara London, who showed my work. And the residents and I are both in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. So that's one of those stamps you get for hanging out forever. It's that they buy your work and then they're duty bound to show it and celebrate it. So if in fact our collaboration kind of jump started the MoMA deal, that makes a lot of sense. And then I've known Homer, and through Homer, the residents, since the 1970s. On my first trip to California to show work and to make some work, our mutual friend Chip Lord from the group Ant Farm said, oh, there's these guys you've got to meet. They're called the Residents. And they've got like a studio and they're fucking around with laser discs. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And I went to meet the residents we've determined that this is which studio, Homer, that the residents had?
Well, that was probably the Grove Street studio.
It was quite an achievement, because I was kicking around with New York City artists who were gluing things together and using gaffer's tape extensively. And then this was a full-fledged recording studio with tons of technology and a lot of hand wiring, but I was struck with a tremendous sense that although the band and the Cryptic Corporation were seen as sort of autodidacts, which they are and were, that there was a tremendous amount of practice involved in what they were doing. And I hadn't heard the music before. I showed some videos, the residents showed some videos and played some songs, and I left with an armful of vinyl. I was very impressed, and across the years, across the decades, we found many opportunities to work together on things both small and significant. But Homer, I think the history of taking God in three persons is how a lot of what people saw on stage came out, because you invited me to see a staged version of this at the ACT in San Francisco. You want to talk about that? Because that was, I thought, oh, wow, this is a big step forward.
Yeah, it's been the whole idea. I mean, of all the projects that the residents have done, God in Three Persons has long been at the top of the list of things that they felt like could have been developed beyond just the album stage. And there's been talk of it. There was talk with the Brooklyn Academy of Music back in the late 80s. One way or another of making this happen. And one of the residents did more of a solo performance about 7 or 8 years ago. It was called Sam's Enchanted Evening, and that did played in at the Marsh in Berkeley for a few weeks, and then also played in New York, and it was very successful. The producer and director of that were so excited when it was over. They said to me, it's like, hey, what that was great. What else is on the residents list of what they want to do? And well, ka-ching, got in 3 persons. So these two guys that are both in New York and are both veterans of the New York theater and art world, Steve Saporito and Travis Chamberlain. We started working at that point, 7 or 8 years ago, to make this happen. And Steve had a connection with ACT in San Francisco. So for a while we were working through them. And we did a staged reading with them. And I suppose that could potentially still come back around. I have no idea. But the woman who's the artistic director has since left. There's been a big change there. That so far that communication has not continued, but the communication, the conversation with the MoMA, which was kind of in parallel with that, did continue. And another thing with the MoMA that I'd like to mention that caused it to gain momentum was the fact that the museum was closed down for most all of the COVID thing is making my timelines are very kind of
we're all on COVID time.
Yeah, exactly. But it was closed down not this past year, but most of the previous year. And when they reopened, they had a mandate of only exhibiting things that were in the permanent collection. So because we were in the permanent collection, that then gave our curators, a higher position to be able to leverage the performance.
I saw the ACT staged reading, and I've always loved God in 3 Persons. It's like one of those exotic cheeses where the smell is unusual and you're like, oh. But then you take a bite and then you take another bite and you take another bite and you realize that the fragrance, the thing that might be slightly repelling, is actually part of the allure. And when you really study the text of the work, you realize that there's darker, and then God in 3 Persons.
Yeah.
And the musical director for the project is Joshua Raul Brody, and who is a mutual friend. And I thought what he did with the reorchestration was extremely powerful. The residents' performance of the work in the stage reading, because of the intimacy and the directness of it, was kind of overwhelming in a way. You're watching a very dark character tell a very articulated story about something that is truly horrifying. And the psychology of the character, as the character gets deeper and deeper and deeper into this mess. I mean, it's the story of a disgraced preacher who encounters and adopts, in a way, 2 miracle workers, or perhaps miracle workers, who also are conjoined twins. And their gender, and the question of their gender and his attraction, crosses a series of lines until it ends with a fairly gruesome scene, and then a very light-hearted kind of sort of sparkling, clear, sunny day resolution, which you kind of doubt because the intensity has been absolutely beyond any expectations. So I saw the staged reading and I was impressed by the impact that it had on me. But I went and I spoke to Homer and the residents, and I said, well, the narrator is telling you step by step exactly what happened. So what's going to be on stage? How is this going to go from being kind of like an intimate concert to being something that's really staged? And so we had a discussion about that. And I said, well, you know, if we did video, what we could do is we could bring the questions that I'm asking that I think it would be interesting for the audience to ask themselves about. Is this real? What does this mean? How does a person get to this point, cross all those various lines? And then at the very end, just the nature of storytelling and memory and reminiscence could be flipped a whole bunch of different ways. There are positive resolutions from the story, but a lot of them are kind of packed deeply into the main character named Mr. X. And we don't really, I felt that seeing the twins, who are these magical, possibly imaginary, but certainly almost angelic characters, seeing them on stage wouldn't be as interesting as portraying them in a way where they shape-shifted and they had the kind of elusive appeal that is clearly driving Mr. X insane. So that conversation was like, oh, and Homer and the residents were supportive. So I started writing an adaptation. I just said, well, let me show you what I think might be possible. And I sat down and very quickly, and listening over and over again and finding the nuance, and then saying, well, this would be interesting on screen. And then started to involve multiple screens for how we might tell this kind of layered story. And I sent it to Homer and the residents, and I said, well, tell me what you think. And a positive response. And so I think in 2017, end of 2017, we did a demo for Hard and Tenderly. And I took some material that the residents had generated, some visual material. And then we involved Lee Barbier, who is a fantastic artist, illustrator, painter, sculptor, and she made a series of elements which are actually in the final work, but I collaged all those together, and we kind of started playing with this idea of Mr. X on stage with various kinds of projections. And then I expanded that to include a doppelganger of Mr. X, because a lot of the tension inside of Mr. X is a kind of a battle of wills. And I thought, well, it'd be really interesting to portray that, because you have the twins, you have a lot of duality in the work, and a lot of times where there is an attempt to come together, but it ends up being a collision. We got to that point in 2018, and then the MoMA thing clicked in, and after some negotiations, we were in production November, actually right around this time in 2019. And then we're at the lab 2 weeks before we went to MoMA, and Travis came in to take what I had written, and we elaborated the actual staging. We cast a great dancer named Caitlin Hicks as the shadow Mr. X. And at the lab, we put it all together in about a 2-week period, and then did our preview dress rehearsals, all the while raising money to pay for this, which was actually, I just was contacted by one of the residents' fans who had supported our Indiegogo campaign, remarking again about how much he appreciated supporting the work, but also we sold various aspects of the production, authenticated merchandise from the residents, which is a tremendous engine for the residents to be able to put together the kind of budgets that they, because if you went and pitched this straightforward to anyone, I think they would be aghast.
So somebody out there, somebody out there has signed merchandise from Randy Rhoads, is what you're saying.
Well, Randy, I don't think Randy signed anything. The residents signed a bunch. I actually ended up signing some things. God knows what that's worth. But we sold puppets, we sold masks, we sold props that were actually featured on screen and in the performance. As part of, you make a donation and you get such and such, you get a signed poster or you get an LP or, and that was actually.
We did an Indiegogo campaign that was successful in terms of raising the additional money that we needed beyond what the MoMA would put up.
Right. Is that, there's a whole lot of credits at the end of Dance Dance. Is Dance Dance Dance, sorry. Is that all Indiegogo supporters?
No, the Indiegogo supporters are on, I think, the insert flyer that we did for the MoMA show. Okay. Dance Dance Dancer is everyone who contributed to Dance Dance Dance, which I had the honor of taking Die 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 by the residents, and they asked me to take the fan-generated dance material and collage that all together. And I was really impressed, number one, by the number of people who responded, and number two, residents fans aren't just kindergarten kids chasing a shiny object. They get really involved. And some people had contributed 3 or 4 different clips. They got costumed up. There's a woman performance artist from Argentina who just did some remarkable dance work. And then there were people who just sort of loped along with the song, but a lot of it is their true connection to the band and to the band's vision. Mm-hmm. And that's not to be underestimated.
Yeah, fans are very loyal.
Yeah, I feel like with the residents, there's not really there's no middle ground. You're either you're in it or you're not, right? Like there's
yeah, pretty much, yeah. Or you never heard of it and couldn't care less.
Although at the same time, like
yeah, or you say the residents and they go, the residents.
That's we may or may not have done that a few months ago, but but no, it was funny when I was telling people we were doing this interview. It's sort of, they've kind of been like in the background at like the periphery of the culture for so long that like usually when I would say the residents, they wouldn't know what I was talking about. But as soon as I showed a picture of like the eyeball masks with the top hats, they were like, oh, those guys. And another thing I kind of noticed as I was going through a lot of resident stuff to get ready for this interview is that the residents were doing a lot of what we now just consider to be internet culture, right? Because internet culture is kind of gone a little bit off the deep end, but they were doing that in the 70s. And so I was kind of, and a lot of it is the visual aesthetics. And I was kind of wondering how the residents put together the visual aesthetics. Is it usually a collaboration like with the with the God in Three Persons performance, where you had a videographer and you had a person doing collage work to go into the video, or is it coming from the residents themselves, a lot of it?
Well, it's usually very collaborative. I mean, I'm the person historically who's had the responsibility of bringing these things to life, of making an album cover or a new group photo or whatever. But it's usually a collaboration, and it usually starts off with the discussion, conversation among the group, and then that branches out, just depending on what the resources and interest of the project might be. Obviously, with God in Three Persons, that's at the top level in terms of the resources that we've been able to come up with, and the number of people that are interested and willing to get involved.
And there's in various of the projects that I've been very honored to do with the residents, there are some basic attributes that you can track, and it starts way before I got involved with the notion of reinvention. They did, when I was in high school and they were already functioning artists, the residents did a very ambitious project called Vileness Fats. Mm. And if you get a chance to find any of the sort of the existing material on YouTube, you'll find that Vileness Fats is not only predating internet culture, but a lot of the DIY, anyone can be an artist sensibility that started in the 50s and 60s and kind of flourished in the 80s, 90s, and now. And there is a combination of deep thought and handcrafted result that is in almost every residence project. There's a really beautiful presentation surface, and as you dig down, you can see and feel the involvement of the band and the Cryptic Corporation in everything they do. So they build these worlds, they create this consciousness for each individual project. Mm-hmm. Cube E, The King and I, Eskimo, God in Three Persons. And there are always, there's always as much interest, I think, for fans in that totality as there is in the rough, hand-hewn edges of each project. You really, it doesn't take much to deconstruct it because it's put together in a way that invites you to take it apart. And that, for me, is evidenced in the sound. Starts with a kind of an innocence and a naivete, which then reveals itself to be much more sophisticated than you thought. So as I'm listening to God in Three Persons over and over again, I'm going, I know where this comes from. It comes from some basic American songbook hymns and blues, and there's the notion of a talking blues, the way the narrator functions throughout the piece. But it's incredibly sophisticated, because I also had to look, and I worked with Homer on this, to cull what would be the definitive lyrics. There were a dozen different versions out there in different forms, all with different words. And so it was a matter of saying, all right, well, what's the definitive libretto for this? And you could see how the libretto would change. Some things would get more defined, some things would get less defined. And the same thing is true musically. The music starts off with a very basic allure, but the more you listen to it, the more it gets into you, and you realize that there were a lot of sophisticated decisions that went into this kind of very simple presentation. And working on how God in Three Persons would look projected like, really big. Number one, we cast a tremendous artist named Jiz Lee. Jiz is a gender fluid performer known as a genderqueer porn star, but also an author and a director and an impresario, but also a force of nature. And I'd worked with Jiz before, and I said, Jiz, I want you to play conjoined twins. And I said, here's the story. If you say no, I completely understand. And Jiz said, no. This piece, written in 1988, politically, it was well ahead of its time in talking about the nature of gender, our perception of gender, our fear of that fluidity,
Yeah, like way ahead of the curve, because like I don't even think like the Judith Butler Gender Trouble book wasn't going to come out for another 3 years.
We were still dealing with
Came out,
basic
yeah.
feminism in the 1980s. And this goes way, way, way beyond this. Again, coming from a naive point of view, but involving a lot of sophisticated thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of parts of the piece that resonate now, maybe resonate now more than they did in 1988 even. Particularly the gender fluidity aspect, but also I think this sort of the Mr. X character, like a lot of the promotional materials describe him as like a Colonel Tom figure. But just sort of this, I think the ways that Mr. X is generic are kind of resonant, because there is this like strong anger in the culture against the presence of this gender fluidity. And I'm kind of curious, because I wasn't around in 1988, if that was something that was like very present, or was that a thing that the residents encountered personally?
Ultimately, it came out, and for all practical purposes, fell flat on its face, and got extremely little attention. I mean, the residents were very proud of it. They felt like it was, at that point, they hadn't been around for 20 years, but they were getting close to 20 years. The idea of reinventing themselves has always been important to the residents, but at the same time, when you start out, you hit all the obvious stuff in the beginning, and the sense of reinvention or doing stuff new becomes incremental. It becomes smaller and smaller instead of giant leaps that you can make. And God in Three Persons was definitely a giant leap at that point that was completely ignored by the culture. And so what they did was they quickly moved on to QB, which was reworking of American music. And then as that spun itself into Elvis and redoing a lot of Elvis songs, well, you can imagine the amount of attention that they got for redoing Elvis, as opposed to doing, conjoined twins that are gender fluid and get abused by their mentor. It didn't get a lot of attention in the 80s.
That's another thing that in 1988, the idea of the father figure as sexual predator, that even makes us uncomfortable now, but it's there. And what I thought when I saw the ACT reading was that the happy ending, the we all lived happily together, even though I've split the conjoined twins, spoiler alert, is still tremendously in question, because it's not a happy ending, but it's a happy ending that the narrator wants, and the narrator is essentially telling the story. So the winners in history are determined by who writes the story, and Mr. X's story here, if you really kind of say, all right, well, I'm going to embrace this, but I'm going to question it, it sends you all the way back to the beginning of the piece to question every single thing that he's brought to the party. And you realize that this is both confessional and a self-portrait, because the self-portrait is a disguise that he's wearing as he's telling the story. And we don't exactly tell you where the confessional is coming from, but he's in a wheelchair. It's probably an old person's home. He's probably, not that far from death. So this idea of the memories being washed, the memories being refreshed, is a really sophisticated narrative conceit. And I thought, God, this would be a really great thing to put up on screen, so we're all getting teary-eyed at the end. Oh, it's so happy. And then we're thinking, wait a second, that has nothing to do with what he just did like 10 minutes ago.
Oh yeah, in like a lot of U.S. pop culture, which I feel like that's another thread that goes through the residents, is this sort of collision between classical sources and these various icons of U.S. pop culture. A lot of the stuff is sort of these pastoral portraits of omission by people that did end up being outed as predators. Like in 1988, I'm pretty sure the highest rated television program in the country was The Cosby Show. Um, and I mean, I guess this stuff's sort of always been in the background. Maybe, well, I guess now it's sort of in the foreground. It's in the news all the time.
Homer made a statement about the piece falling flat on its face, but now, and this is both the aspect of elapsed time, but it's also as you say, the cultural context has shifted dramatically as generations shift. It's considered a classic. It's considered a triumphant classic. And so one wonders what the residents are doing today, how that will be perceived decades from now. And then holistically, what they've done over the course of their careers is there's really nothing else that comes close to the consistency of spitting in the face of history, questioning the classics, reinventing or reinvigorating genres to a certain extent. There's really nothing else that exists on the same level. And I don't know how old they are, but at their age, I met them in the 70s, and I'm 66 now. They're just getting—
They're a turtle. They're
getting better. They're working faster, and the intelligence that's coming out. I don't know if you know about the last residence project that I was involved in, but maybe Homer will talk about it. I did Bury My Bone as a music video for, but that's another twist within a twist within a twist within a twist, and this is in their 5th or 6th decade of work.
Got to be at least the 5th, because there was talk of, apparently there's been a movie in the works for 50 years.
Well, that reflects back on what John said a few minutes ago about the film stuff, the Violence Fats film stuff, which, you know, once again, you can check out little segments of it on YouTube. It's quite unique, but the residents worked on it for 4 years, from 72 to 76. And I mean, John keeps bringing up naivete, and naivete has always been kind of a heavy value for the residents. And it's one of those things that it's kind of a double-bladed sword. You know, its charm can be undeniable. On the other hand, it can lead the naive into dark alleys where strange things can happen. And what happened was the residents put so much money. I mean, they could see that video was the coming thing. Yeah. And so they went out and bought a bunch of what at that time was called industrial quality video equipment. It was 1/2-inch reel-to-reel black and white video. And then they did these incredibly elaborate, beautiful sets and these amazing pieces. And then after about 4 years, somebody unfortunately broke the news to them that the only way that they were ever going to be able to share this was to gather a bunch of people together in somebody's living room and show it to them. It was never going to be able to be exposed beyond that. Of course, now it's on YouTube.
Fast forward 40 years. Were the laser discs that John saw when he first encountered the residents, was there a laser disc component to this project or at any point, or was that a different thing?
No, that was a different thing. You know, I think at that point, they had become, you know, once Violence Fats fell on its face, you know, they kind of distanced themselves from it for a while. And as video came back around again and they started creating more commercial video projects, well, the idea of taking at least what existed and making something out of it, which they did a half-hour video called Whatever Happened to Violence Vets. And then they kind of touched on that again in the early 2000s with a Residence video DVD compilation called Icky Flicks. So there've been points at which it was exposed, but over the years there were all these conversations about, you know, doing something more with it, you know, giving it a sense of completion in a way. And
I remember reading somewhere that the original conceived project was supposed to be about 12 hours long.
no, that was more the amount of video that got shot. It was supposed to be a feature. It was always supposed to be a feature. But what happened was that all these conversations about completing it in some way, would one lead to another, nothing would happen. And then, you know, there's a documentary filmmaker, a guy named Don Hardy, who did a beautiful documentary on the Residents called Theory of Obscurity. It came out, I think, in 2015. So Don, in the process of creating this video, wanted to gather up all of the Residents film and video stuff that they had done in order to have that as part of the material that he would use in the documentary. And in the process, he became extremely enamored with the Violence Vets material. And so I was the person on the Residents and Cryptic side that was sort of the facilitator for John, for Don. And we had several conversations about this, and I took this back to the Residents, and it's like they started thinking about it, and it's like, well, we're not going to complete it. I mean, so much of its charm is dependent upon naivete. You don't go back and recreate naivete from 30 years earlier or 40 years earlier or whatever.
But there's also there's something very exciting about like a large unfinished project too, though, like the Walter Benjamin Arcades project or something like that.
It can also be very haunting. It can haunt you. You know, there's a lack of closure, which is alluring, but that lack of closure can weigh very, very heavily on you if it's always on the to-do list, but never gets crossed off.
Yeah. And it's easy to create mystique around these things, but I have found a lot of times when these things eventually do come to life, usually what comes to life is not up to the mystique that it created ahead of it. Hopefully that's not the case here. We'll find out. But ultimately the Residents went back and wrote a brand new screenplay that essentially incorporated all the elements of Violence Vets as well as a certain amount of the Violence Vets material into a new screenplay. And the idea was that the protagonist whose life is spiraling out of control, his life is echoing the life of the protagonist in Violence Vets. So you have these two things that keep kind of ping-ponging back and forth. And that screenplay was called Double Trouble. And we started trying to raise money for that. And we're semi-successful. You know, raised, you know, a little over 10% of what we needed to actually do it. And then all of a sudden, you know, bam, the lockdown comes. The Residents have a tour that was scheduled, American tour that was scheduled for last spring. It was canceled. A lot of time opened up in front. And so once again, the idea starts to circulate. Well, what if we rewrote that again, but rewrote it from the point of view of doing it with the money that we have? And a all of a sudden that idea catches fire. And so, about a month or 6 weeks ago, we completed a 10-day production schedule of shooting the new material, which then also incorporates a certain amount of Violence Fest material, but then also incorporates material that was done for Double Trouble to be used as a fundraising trailer. So that material then becomes flashback. So ultimately, not more than, 45 minutes to an hour's worth of new material had to be shot. And it's in post-production now. Residents are working on the soundtrack.
Awesome.
And
That's awesome.
yeah, and it should come out sometime next year.
And they
And
asked
once again, recruited John again.
Yeah, I have, in the last few years, what's been very gratifying is the residents' invitation into the canon. So there are a lot of previous things that we did together. I did a history of the residents with Penn and Teller as the hosts. This was back in the 1980s, and that was really interesting. But I was a spectator. And now with God in Three Persons, Bury My Bone, Dance, 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 and then now working on some sequences for the movie, they're giving me permission to go in and manipulate the canon. And that has been very, very gratifying because they are very collaborative, they are very generous, they are very supportive. They have very distinct objectives, but they get you to play within those objectives. And that's a lot of fun. So dealing with specific iconography that the band is identified with, and then having fun with that, inverting it or playing games with your recognition of that iconography, takes on a whole new dimension for me as both a collaborator and also as a fan. Because at the end of the day, I'm a Residents fan.
That's like a huge sandbox to play in. I mean, so many records, so many videos, so much.
You're getting
so
to
many
remix.
things, yeah.
You're getting to remix something that is pretty essential. And while the band's base is significant and always growing, there's enough space in that canon so that the manipulation has some kind of effect on the totality of how the band operates. And it's like being invited in as a guest artist with all the perils, but once you banish that fear that you're going to fuck something up, you get a chance to kind of comment on how you feel about the residents and their canon. At the same time, you're talking on the bandwidth that's appropriate to the fans, but also it's a dialogue with the band. It's a dialogue with the residents. And that's very, particularly when we did God in Three Persons, which we are it's going to go back out live next year. And we're going to add 3 songs to the existing songs that we did at the Museum of Modern Art. So it will represent the entire album from 1988. And I'm working on the new adaptation, and I think, well, we've had a Shadow Mr. X. How can I take that maybe to the next level? And so I made some recommendations, and again, they're like, oh yeah, that's really good. And there's also, this is kind of a secret, there are a number of visual and numeric elements that I find I'm playing with over and over and over again, besides just the basic duality. And they've encouraged that by their assent in the way that I've presented material, particularly now for the new movie. this idea of 4, 2, and 1 is something that I find recurring over and over again in residence projects.
And so is there any fear at the Cryptic Corporation once this movie comes out and gets huge that the residents are going to go Hollywood?
I've
Well,
read the script. I don't think it's possible.
You know, the residents had their
Or does the
opportunity-
Cryptic Corporation want the residents to go Hollywood?
Not well. The Cryptic Corporation is a business entity, so they certainly have no. We certainly have no problem with the idea of more business opportunities, but at the same time, the concept of going Hollywood seems pretty remote, shall we say?
I mean, it seems pretty relatable. Like everybody's wearing a mask in public now. Like, you know, this is kind of the world the residents created.
Yeah, but the mask in public doesn't eliminate, doesn't present a clean slate.
This is true.
And the idea that these writers, performers, directors are basically a slate onto which we can project ourselves is absolutely unusual. And I asked Homer and the residents a while ago, actually around the time of the ACT thing, about the notion that a resident would be performing Mr. X within this stage reading. And there's a criticality about how roles and characters are defined by the band. And the answer I got back was that the residents are spirits. And the notion of being a resident is a spiritual concern. And a few years ago, they did a project called I Am a Resident. And I would love to hear Homer talk about that, because I thought that put a real interesting focus on how we deify cultural icons and cultural forces.
Yeah, I mean, if you got any thoughts on that, Homer.
Well, I'm trying to reflect back now. It's exactly where that came from, but the idea was to, you know, as John has remarked upon the residents' canon being open for him to play with. Well, the idea of this was to open it to their fans and let them play with it. Mm-hmm. And you know, the doors opened, and the idea was, okay, create your own version of a resident song. And in a way, John talking about it was a very parallel thing to the dance. It's like, you know, we expected, okay, well, maybe there'll be 50 or 60 you know, people, artists that will contribute something, and we could pick out the dozen of those that we like the best, and make it an album. And what happened was that, you know, there were 200 different pieces that came back, and the quality was so high that it was like, oh, I mean, the idea of just picking out a dozen of them, or 15 or 20, and putting out an album, I mean, that does not do this body of work justice. And so, well, we have to rethink this. And what happened was that the residents then went back and reworked the reworking of their own material. And so they took all that material, and, you know, in the same ways that they allowed the fans to take and reinterpret it, well, they then reinterpreted all of this material, which then all of a sudden becomes a completely different work. And that was I Am a Resident, which once again was a pretty unique and I think very successful project.
Yeah, and I think it lines up really well with a lot of the prior residence projects like the American Composers series, where you had all the James Brown covers, the King and I with all the Elvis interpretations. So it sort of comes full circle. Although were they covering Residence songs, or were they trying to do their own version of like what is a Residence song, like the kind of metaphysical?
No, they were
what is a Residence song?
covering resident songs. They were
Okay.
covering resident songs. I mean, there weren't many rules, but I think that was one of the rules, was that you had to pick a resident song, and how you interpreted it could be fairly wide open. But yeah, that's what they were doing.
Cool.
So to most of the world, we've just now talking about the residents in terms of their performances, always wearing masks, and talk about their fans. John, you were describing them as a spirit, but you all have worked with them directly. What are they like when the masks are off?
Do the masks ever come off?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, whose mask ever comes off completely? I
True,
mean,
true. When the
but-
eternal mask comes off, there's the built-in mask.
yeah, exactly. But I think from their point of view, they would say that they're fairly boring. That's why they wear masks. If you bumped into one on the street, you certainly wouldn't make any impression, or at least that's their perspective.
The only thing I can say is that in conversation, you wouldn't peg them as the iconoclasts and the rule breakers and the poke the hornet's nest characters that they are. But the minute they go on stage, there is a transformation that is astounding. It's like gravity, the rules of gravity have been changed, the rules of physics have been bent, and the channeling of a raw and powerful emotion has been unleashed. And that's actually something that is always astounding. They did a performance at the Berkeley Art Museum a few years ago. My wife was she's a pianist, Sarah Cahill, and she invited the residents to perform in the original Berkeley Art Museum atrium, which was this big concrete structure and this amazing center space. And I don't know what I was expecting. I'd seen the residents perform for a long, long time, but there was a shock wave followed by a heat blast, followed by this searing version of a song. And the audience, people's hair were blasted back, their faces were, and then I remember going backstage and everyone's just there sipping a drink and, very convivial and very placid. There are things that ignite the band and obviously inspire them, because they could have rested and retired years and years and years ago. They just refuse to do that. And I find that unbelievably admirable and inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what kind of world it would be without the residents. Yeah, I guess I've never seen them live. So like in the live show though, I've heard that there's a lot of stuff with images, pictures, obviously costumes, and apparently Sarah Cahill on the piano sometimes.
Sarah's never played for the residents. Sarah did commission the residents to write a work. Sarah and I had a video piano project a few years ago called A Sweeter Music. And because I thought it would be a challenge both to Sarah and the personality of the residents to take their perspective and put it into a classical or new music setting, she commissioned them to write a work called Fife No Drum. And it was a really great piece with spoken word and visual appearances by one of the residents. And it was a really charming contemporary music work, out of context in some ways, but it added tremendous value to the project that Sarah and I were doing.
And actually, that now you're mentioning the spoken word thing, I'm kind of remembering. So the last time that John was on the program, we were talking about Robert Ashley's Perfect Lives, which is I'm not going to call it a spoken word opera because Mimi Johnson's going to be angry, but it's an opera with something that's in between singing and speech. It doesn't resemble God in three persons in many other ways beyond that, and I think obviously the more dominant I guess subtext is blues talking. But I was wondering if the residents ever mentioned anything to you, Homer, about some potential connection between the works, or the fact that it does kind of play like this. It has operatic themes. There's a person speaking for most of it, and they're speaking in kind of a very mannered musical way, I guess.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure they are aware of the piece, but at the same time, if there's any connection, they've never really spoken about it to me.
Just something in the water, I guess.
Well, I'm attracted to the otherworldliness of the narrators. I feel like I'm very drawn to what makes American messiahs, the hucksters, the flim-flam artists, the unreliable nature of storytelling, the roadside attraction of someone who's promising something transcendent, and even though the intention is not fully delivered, the experience ends up being transformative. And I think Ashley had that at the core of a lot of his work. He calls it an opera for television. It's neither an opera nor is it television. It's a merger between the two. And the residents, the way that they create the assault on whatever it is they're trying to attack, and sometimes it's not an overt message like that, but there is this subversive agenda that it's very seductive to buy into. Usually it's that front voice or that front persona that's created for a work that is what hooks me. Bury My Bone, for example, I was working with the residents. I understood the mythology that these were found songs that the residents were reinterpreting. And when they came to the studio to be videotaped, to be recorded, I had little idea of how they would present themselves. I knew how I was going to create the environment. And so when the lead singer showed up, I was like, well, that's interesting.
Is this the famed singing resident?
I can't say a name or anything like that, but it was the resident who came in and performed the lead. And I thought there were quotations in the choices of their presentation that not only fit exactly what I was doing, but also allowed me to create a lot of ancillary elements that would take that and put it into a fun and entertaining. And this was all during COVID, so it was one of those things where we had to be very, very careful in the practicalities of performance, but it allowed me in post-production to go into very unusual spaces.
And speaking of COVID, how's how's the shutdown been treating you, Homer?
It's actually been fairly kind to me. I'm heavily involved in this the film project, and so it really has kind of enabled me in a way that I certainly was not anticipating, and it's to back up a little bit, I had a partner that I worked with, Hardy Fox, for over 40 years, who died a couple of years ago. And about 3 years before that, he sort of unexpectedly announced that he wanted to retire. And, personally, I've been having too much fun. I had no desire to retire. And, but it threw me into a lot of turmoil. And then spinning out of that, all of which went in a very positive way, but at the same time, I felt like, I'm having to do the work of two people. So I had a couple of 3 years there where I felt like I was working, 10, 11, 12 hours a day, 24/7.
So are you the
7
only
days a week.
you're the only employee of the Cryptic Corporation currently?
Well, I am the
Or I guess
you know,
you're
so-
probably a CEO.
yeah, the
executive
only kind
status.
of regular everyday employee. There are a lot of different. Anyway, so the COVID situation in a way has allowed me to kind of refine what I feel like is a more sustainable balance, live-work balance. It's allowed me to kind of get back to a person that I remember that I used to be some time ago. And that's been satisfying and positive.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Homer, may I ask where you grew up? Because you said couple three, which means, use the phrase couple three, which means you're probably not from California originally.
No, I'm from the South. I'm originally from Shreveport, Louisiana.
Okay.
And recently had a trip back there for my mom's 95th birthday.
Oh, happy birthday, Homer's mom.
Yeah. Happy birthday.
She keeps trucking along. Everybody wonders how, but she does. And at this point, I mean, she smoked for 50 years. So she has been diagnosed with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And she is on oxygen most of the time, but nothing seems to slow her down. You just keeps moving ahead. So
I took one of those. I think it was in the New York Times, maybe one of those things where they figure out based on your dialect where it matches the most, like based on certain words. You say submarine or hoagie. It placed me in Shreveport, Louisiana. I have never been to Louisiana. I have planned to go there for I don't know how long. I almost made a road trip there when I was in college. Never happened. But apparently I talk like I'm from Shreveport, which you probably don't hear.
I've noticed that. I've noticed that over the last 65 whatever episodes of the podcast.
I like the fact that Daniel looks like he's coming from witness protection as the backlight gets brighter and brighter. And he looks like a gravy stain that was left over from yesterday's big dinner, because clearly we need to get him one of those little circle lights so he's got his delightful features more well illuminated in the future.
Yeah, I mean, like when it's not as overcast, it's a nice view out the window. But right now, it kind of looks like the day after. Yeah, there's some like fallout going on out there.
But if you just turned the whole thing around, you'd have nice front light. But
well, let's see if my power cord goes that far.
I'm not suggesting you do it, but it's
There we go.
better.
A little better.
Hey,
Not perfect.
But it may be the Radio Shack computer that's at fault.
Yeah. Oh, I can't get the Radio Shack computer to do video yet. I got the floppy drives working,
Oh, that's good.
but everything else is in need of some restoration.
Which makes me think back to what Homer was saying about Violence Fats being done on half-inch open reel video. The notion of time and longevity and just plain obstinance relates to all of the different ways in my life as a video artist that we've dealt with recording material, and how each new successive format has basically tossed the previous one. So half-inch, 3/4 inch, 1-inch, 2-inch quad, then digital file formats, floppy disks, jazz drives, outmoded SCSI.
Wait, jazz drives? I don't remember jazz drives.
There were a series of loadable disks that would have like, I don't know, 200 megabytes on them or something.
Oh, like a zip disk kind of?
Zip disk, yeah. They were called jazz drives though. Zip drives, SCSI port hard drives, which I can't find any way to read it. So it's like this idea that you can't, we're stopping ourselves in some ways from going backwards. It's not only that it's a memory, it's a distant thought, it's beyond arm's reach. It's that we've erected these barriers. You've got the recording, you've got the recording medium without a way to actually read what's on that medium. And there's something very prophetic about it, something very sad about it, but also kind of something incredibly appropriate about how we segment time. And I know that the Residence archive is considerable, and it should be interesting at some point when that archive is fully indexed and all of the dots are connected by someone in the distant future.
It's going to take a lot of gizmos, I'm guessing.
Yes, somebody with a lot of time on their hands.
Well, harness the power of that fan base. Each fan has to only take a little bit, and this is a crowdsourcing the work.
It's a good idea.
This is
And the fans would love it. The fans would love this.
You could make like a project called I Am a Resident with a working Betamax VCR and get that one person,
Yeah,
I've never seen a working Betamax VCR. I think they all died. I've been like looking for years, but you were about to say something, Homer.
No, I was just going to say I don't want all those people in my studio.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that would be poor social distancing.
It would
for
be.
sure.
It would be.
No, what you need is part of it is that each person has to set up their own studio to get everything shipped to them, and then they have to go and figure everything out. So that one person with that one working Betamax needs to have the whole place tricked out.
Yeah. Well, I'll put that on the list. It's not going to be very high up, though.
I mean, that, or I guess you could just leave it at a university library, and then it's their problem.
No, I'm actually dealing with, a lot of the Residence film and video stuff has gone to the MoMA, and I'm dealing with them about sending my video archive as well as the music archive, but then everything got shut down with the COVID stuff. So that conversation is not over, but it certainly has been kind of plateaued for a while now.
So when you were saying that you're in the permanent collection at the MoMA, you were meaning like almost like the MoMA has the permanent Residence collection, or is in the process of assembling the Residence, the presidential library of the Residence, as it were.
you know, I don't know exactly how it all works. It's like, you know, the permanent collection is, you know, you have, I think you have curators that nominate things for the permanent collection, and then there's some board somewhere that has to decide whether they're going to ratify that or not. And exactly what residents' things are in the permanent collection and which ones they have but aren't designated that way, I don't really know. I mean, you know, there was a residence collectible from a couple of 3 years ago called the UBS, the Ultimate Box Set.
Oh, the thing in the refrigerator. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a refrigerator that has a first edition of everything that the residents have ever put out. And that is in the MoMA, in a warehouse somewhere. God only knows when and if it'll ever see the light of day. But I really don't know. Is that also in the permanent collection along with videos that I know are in, or I don't know. It's all kind of vague and fuzzy to me.
It's what's amusing is to think of the residents and the establishment and structure of the art world trying to do kind of a dance together, because you would think that they would be mutually exclusive, that trying to define and categorize the residents outside of just the obvious things would be a fool's errand. But that's where art has gotten to, because the boundaries of what the definition of various things are. Yes, if they bought the UBS, it's in a warehouse somewhere, and they'll pull it out for an exhibition of something at some point so that they can show it off. I was in Paris a few years ago, and I went to the Pompidou Center, and they have a bunch of my stuff in the permanent collection. And unbeknownst to me, I went upstairs to where they have their viewing galleries, and there was my stuff. And nobody had told me, and nobody had written me an email saying, hey, we're going to show your stuff. You know, they paid the $500 for each work, and they have the right license to be able to show it. So I thought, okay, this is how the relationship is very one-sided. But at the same time, we're currency. And once you've accepted the fact that you're currency and you've accepted dollars for it, you have to kind of just walk away.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not your refrigerator anymore, I guess.
No. And that's fine. That's fine. I've got copies of all that stuff, you know.
Oh yeah, did the MoMA buy? I can't remember how many copies of that there were. Was there just one refrigerator, or were there multiple refrigerators?
Well, there were. The idea was it was an addition of 10, but there haven't been a huge number of brave souls that have stepped up with $100,000 to make that happen. So really, only two have manifested themselves in the flesh, so to speak, and the second one, I have no idea what condition it's in. This was a guy in Indiana who was a huge Residence fan, or was, and he is part of the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical fortune, and ultimately he decided to spend some of his money on this UBS, and Don Hardy, this all happened when Don was making Theory of Obscurity. And so we went to his place in Indiana in order to document the delivery of the UBS to him. And all of which Don has, and it's a beautiful little short film that it's kind of like there wasn't really a way to squeeze it into Theory of Obscurity, but it's its own little kind of 10-minute film. But anyway,
so if anybody, if anybody listening has $100,000 and wants the UBS, is it still available?
Let's talk. Let's talk. But anyway, so this guy split up with his wife at some point in there, seemed to feel like the residents were instrumental in the split. He got very strange and very distant, and in the process of making his payments for the UBS, stopped making those payments, and then got very abusive towards me in a series of texts. And consequently, I haven't had any contact with him in, I don't know, 4 years now, 3 or 4 years, something like that. It's kind of a strange and in a way kind of sad story, because I actually got to know him and his wife fairly well. They were interesting people. I could tell that they had their problems, but it ultimately kind of spun out in a weird kind of a way, and became obvious to me that, you know, whatever the problems were, I was not going to fix them, and I did not want to be in the middle of them.
And the UBS wasn't helping.
It was not helping.
I mean, was he using it as like their primary refrigerator for food, but also keeping the records in there?
I think that's kind of what his wife saw. I don't, you know, his wife was a lovely person, but she did not get the residents at all. And I think all she saw here was an opportunity to get a new refrigerator, although a very expensive one. And how much, I mean, you know, we shot video of the two of them and of their children, you know, as part of this whole documentary that Don did about the delivery of the UBS. And then at some point they came back later and forbid us to use any imagery of them and their children in the video. And it was, like I say, it was a strange situation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you'd expect something fairly interesting from somebody who's buying a $100,000 refrigerator.
Yeah, I did. I
mean, I guess you'd hope for a happier ending, but
yeah.
it sounds like it's going to be an adventure either way.
Yeah. Well, it was an adventure, and even to the extent that this guy played drums in a marching band, and he had the entire, you know, he and his wife kind of lived separate existences. You know, this was I'm spacing out the name of this. It's the city where I think the University of Indiana is. I'm forgetting. But anyway, she had a very kind of nice suburban home there where she and the kids lived. He had his own place way out in the sticks that you felt like, you know, this is where he kind of retreated to and ultimately spent far too much time by himself. And ultimately that's where it was delivered. And he had the marching band come out there and play as part of the delivery. And, you know, once again, all this, Don documented all this stuff. It's I should actually talk to him and get a copy of that, because it's a very nice piece. But I had really interesting conversations with both of them at that time, kind of like separately. And I got some insight into their relationship. And, you know, well, I don't want to go too far off into this one.
Yeah.
But, you know, people that have money that they don't earn inevitably get estranged. And I felt like that's part of what was going on here. I mean, he had all this money and access to all this money, none of which he had ever earned. Mm-hmm. And all that did was it enabled him to indulge himself and his idiosyncrasies and eccentricities in ways that ultimately weren't healthy. I'll put it that way.
It's an unfortunate story.
Yeah.
But that won't necessarily happen to you if you send Homer $100,000 after hearing this podcast for the.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so.
No, it'll be a redemptive process. You will feel enlightened, and certainly lightened by 100K.
I mean, the MoMA is still open, right? So it's 1 for 2.
Yeah. Yeah, so far.
Set up an Indiegogo.
Send me an email. You can get me at info@crypticore.com.
What you do is you set up an Indiegogo campaign, but you just have one tier, $100,000. You get something for it, of course, but all you need is that one person for that one item.
I think we may have offered it again as part of an Indiegogo campaign. Don had an Indiegogo campaign as part of his funding for Theory of Obscurity. I think maybe we offered it there. But whatever.
Yeah.
It's fading in the rearview mirror, which is.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's so many residence projects that like the next version of that is going to have to be like one of those walk-in fridges you see in the back of a restaurant. I
think a refrigerated 18-wheeler.
We talked about doing an advanced version that was going to come in a boxcar, and would include a residence performance and banquet for you and your friends, but we didn't get too far with that one.
Still on the list, lower
Still
down. Still on the list.
Cool. So I guess there's the big movie that's in post-production. There's the record you guys just came out with whenever the tour for God in Three Persons is happening sometime next year, knock on wood. And is there anything else in the pipeline that we didn't get to?
I don't know. I can't. Those are the most significant things at this point.
Mm-hmm.
There will certainly be more residence albums, but musically their focus right now is soundtrack stuff for the film, which now it went from being Violence Fats to Double Trouble to Triple Trouble, but then it has now evolved into Endless Illusions, which seems to be more appropriate than ever. So soundtrack for Endless Illusions is the main thing on their radar at this point, musically anyway.
And so there's going to be a separate soundtrack release at some point with the film.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, cool. So I guess is there anything else you'd like to say to the listeners?
Well, the only thing of any significance is, yesterday having been Thanksgiving, and the residents had incredibly grateful the residents are that there are enough people out there that enable them to keep doing this. And that is a lovely and wonderful thing.
Amen.
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 And I would say I'm very thankful for being embraced by the residents, and I hope to work with them for many years to come.
Mm.
And I'm thankful for the two of you coming on and talking about the residents.
Yeah, me too. Me too, definitely. This was a lot of fun. And
my pleasure for sure. And it's been nice to be here, and it's been great working with John more and more over the last few years.
yeah, and I gotta say, after I listened to God in Three Persons, I'm not gonna lie, I listened to Double Shot of My Baby's Love probably 15 times last night. Like that thing is like it's like crack. And
It's
a catchy song. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And the resonance, the combination, it's almost like it's a perfect summation of the resonance. The two themes in God in Three Persons, which are Double Shot of My Baby's Love and Holy, 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 the Protestant hymn, from which the phrase God in three persons comes.
It's the sacred and the profane, my friends. Together again on tour.
Right. It's the which one's Donnie and which one's Marie.
Well, nowadays it could be both.
We'll never tell. We'll never tell.
It could be both.
I just introduced Dan to Donnie and Marie just a few days ago, so he's a big fan now.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of creepy subtext, not the same way as the Residence record, but it's an interesting thing to watch, not knowing the context or
Well,
like having lived with it. But
next up is the Carpenters.
oh, the Carpenters, yeah, we covered Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story. How that was a long time. That was like a year ago almost now, right?
Todd Haynes' movie.
Yeah, the one with the Barbie dolls.
Mm-hmm.
That was I don't want to say a fun time. It was an interesting film with a lot of merit. That's it.
Yeah.
It's a better, yeah.
Well, here's to you avoiding arrest.
All right, you too. All right, and yes, stay safe and be well, guys. Thanks for coming on.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you for having us.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure.
Same here.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Sure. And then there were two.
Should we do the sign off?
Oh yeah. So this has been a nominee. I'm still Dan,
And I'm still Ron.
and those were Homer Flynn of the Cryptic Corporation and John Sanborn, contractor to the Cryptic Corporation, and he also does a lot of other things. And see you next week. See you at the movies. I think we're going to be talking about Patrick McGowan next week.
Yes, we are. Very excited about that. All sorts of Patrick McGowan things, except for The Prisoner. We won't be talking about The Prisoner, right? No.
Well, I mean, it's part one potentially of a longer series, but no, I think we're going to be covering Hell Drivers and one of the 3 Columbo episodes he was involved with.
Yeah.
But yeah, Carrie sent like Carrie has seen literally every Patrick McGowan everything ever.
Uh-huh.
That's in any kind of circulation. So maybe the next round we can do an episode of Rafferty, because I was kind of there's like no good copies of it anywhere, but it's basically Dr. House MD, but with Patrick McGowan. And if there's anybody who's better at being like a cranky British person than Hugh Laurie, it was Patrick McGowan.
Okay.
So
He comes across as like he would do cantankerous perfectly. Embody cantankerous.
well, Carrie was telling me he was on the set of, oh God, it was an adaptation of an Elmore Leonard book. I forget what the name of the movie is. And Elmore Leonard is on the set. McGowan is presumably drunk, and he goes up to Leonard and he says, "How does it feel to watch someone ruin your novel?" On the set of the movie. Classic McGowan. But yeah, that's one of breaking you off a little piece of the remix. So, but until next week, take care.
Take care, everyone.